All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Vernon Wall here, he, him pronouns. I'm currently the Director of Business Development with Leadership, and really excited to have you all join us for our fourth virtual conversation. We're so excited to have a guest here, which I will introduce in just a moment, but just want to, first of all, we've all been in a virtual experience for a while now, but just want to let you know how we will move forward today. And that is, we have a lean and mean group today, so we may be able to engage folks via unmuting and chatting. But for the beginning of this, it'd be great if you could just mute yourself and post comments and questions in the chat. What we found is that with these conversations, people have used them to really talk to each other, to ask questions, and to post resources. So want to let you know that it's up to you how you want to engage. If our wonderful speaker says something that really piques your thoughts and you just want to go, you can do that also too. Just emphasizing that sort of thing. We'll definitely use polls throughout the session, so look for that and you'll be able to respond on the screen. Also too, you can also send me a message privately if you'd like, and I can share it if you want to do that. So you've got some options. So we're excited. We're just ready to roll with the conversation. For those of you who don't know us, we are a not-for-profit that's really focused on a just, caring, and thriving world where everyone leads with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. Our goal and our mission is to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. That's who we are at Leadership. I also want to tell you that if you Google the word leadership, you're going to come up with so many definitions, but we would love to share this at the beginning because leadership defines the leadership as just living in a state of possibility, making a commitment to a vision, developing relationships to move that vision into action, and sustaining a high level of integrity. Effective leadership takes place in a context of a community and results in a more equitable society. I also want to let you know that we also take a moment at the beginning of all of our programs and really acknowledge the land in which we are on. And we all are zooming in from different spaces. So really and truly thinking about three things. Number one, Native and Indigenous folks who inhabit the territories that we're in. I'm currently in Washington, D.C., the ancestral homeland of many Native and Indigenous tribes, but primarily the Piscataway and the Anacostic. The second is really thinking about our own ancestry, how we can, the shoulders that we stand on, the people who came before us, and that allows us to connect with Native and Indigenous people. And then third, it's thinking about how we can decolonize higher education. What does it look like to really and truly be about equity? So anytime you hear someone talk about a land acknowledgement, please remember those three things. I'm so excited to have Dr. Ainsley Carey here with us to really talk about navigating Confederate memorials on campus. I think this is a very timely topic, given the context of our country and what's going on. I'm not Kristen Young, but she is our executive director. And so I'm sure she's here in spirit if she doesn't pop in a few moments to join us. So I just wanted to turn it over to Ainsley to sort of introduce himself, and really and truly thank you, Ainsley, for being here.
Vernon, thank you. And I want to thank Leadership for providing this opportunity for us to have this conversation. At the same time, I would also like to acknowledge the land that I am on. I am joining you from Vancouver, Canada, and our campus at the University of British Columbia is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We also have a campus in the Okanagan that is located at the traditional home of the Silk Okanagan people. So thank you for acknowledging the land that we're all joining from. So Vernon, would you like me to jump right in here?
Go right ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, let me say thank you everyone for joining. And let me give a little background on how I came to this topic and why I've been presenting on this topic for the past year and a half, almost 2 years. So in 2015, many of you may remember Charleston, South Carolina. Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church is one of the oldest Black churches in the South. And in June of 2015, they were hosting their Wednesday evening Bible study, as they have done for generations. And a young man entered that Bible study on that Wednesday night and asked to meet with the pastor, Reverend Clemente Pinckney. And he sat in that church on a Wednesday night, and they went through the hour-long Bible study. Well, at the end of the Bible study, when everyone stood and bowed their heads in closing prayer, the gunman, or the young man, revealed his true intention was to kill as many Black people as possible. That's his words. And he pulled out a Glock 45 and shot 12 people in that church. And he unloaded his gun and reloaded the gun again and shot at as many people as possible. 9 people died as a result of that. He exited the church almost as calmly as he entered. He expected that he would be arrested when he stepped outside the door, but no one was there. The next day, he was apprehended by the police in South Carolina, and he was detained and arrested. After doing some further research on the individual, the police found that he worshiped Confederate iconography and the Confederate flag. And his entire motivation was to spark a race war. He wanted to create a race riots throughout the United States as a part of a violent white supremacy movement. Well, it wasn't 2 years later that we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, near the University of Virginia's campus, a similar incident occurred, where there was a protest regarding the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army. There was a proposal by the city to remove that statue that had stood in the downtown area for nearly 100 years. And during that protest, a young man rammed his car at full speed into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 1 woman and injuring 19 others. You might remember then President Trump's response to this incident were, first, there are good people on both sides. President's words, not mine. And then a second part of his response was an attempt to defend Confederate memorials. And his question was, who's next? Are we going to remove Thomas Jefferson, or are we going to remove George Washington? I remember hearing this question, and everyone thought of it as a rhetorical question. But for me, I thought there might be a future generation of Americans that would look at our nation's memorialization and the heroes that we represent and memorialize, and where we represent them and memorialize them, and have a deeper question or grapple with this in a much more serious way than the current generation has, and really consider the memorialization of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the first 12 American presidents. Many of them owned enslaved people. 12 out of 18 of the first US presidents owned enslaved people. At some point, this will be something for our nation to reckon with. And how should we reckon with that? At the same time that this was going on in the US landscape, it was also happening on our college campuses. If your campus is 100 plus years old, chances are there's a Confederate memorial or statue or symbol or building name on your campus that at some point students will recognize, and students will ask the administration to take action on it. And me sitting in a role as Vice President for Student Affairs, I was wondering, how would we grapple with this? How would we facilitate these very difficult conversations about memorialization and the nation's memory and who we worship and what we don't worship? How would we do that on a campus as our universities become more and more diverse, not only with students domestically, but internationally? And that's what began this research. That's what gave birth to the book that I'll be discussing, which is entitled Washington Next. And it's all about disputed monuments, memorials, and honorees on college campuses. I examined 25 universities who had disputed memorials on campus. There were 56 memorials involved. and how those universities grappled with it. So today's conversation is all about presenting the highlights of that work and the major points. I want to talk about the catalysts for these disputes. I've already talked about the Charleston incident. I'd like to talk about why students are protesting. When you examine all of the reports, you dig deep into the students' comments, there's a common theme about what students are protesting. I'd like to talk about how universities have responded to it. And I'd be interested in hearing from the audience about how your university may have responded to it. But for me, the most important part of the work is examining the four frames that I propose that colleges and universities use to grapple with this very difficult conversation. Jamie, next slide, please. So as we mentioned, there are several catalysts to what happened and catalysts that sparked memorial disputes throughout the United States. In my work, I examined the time period from 2015 to 2020, this 5-year time period. Now, memorial disputes in the United States have been going on since the 1920s, when civil rights leaders were looking at the nation's memorial landscapes, where Confederate memorials were being born in the early 1900s. More than 50 years after the Civil War, memorials were being built and established around the country. Civil rights leaders were asking for these memorials not to be built or not to be added. However, at the time, the country was struggling more with issues of health and economics and the welfare of formerly enslaved people in the generations after. So memorials didn't take a prominent role. However, since 2015, a number of institutions and cities and towns have really started moving on the memorial issue, specifically after the Charlottesville riots, after the Charleston massacre. And really, we saw a lot of movement after George Floyd's death. Immediately after George Floyd's death, dozens of companies and sports teams and corporations and the government started to re-examine their memorials. And when I talk about memorials, I'm talking statues, building names, and otherwise, and make difficult decisions about how to move them on. Soon after George Floyd, NASCAR stopped allowing the Confederate flag to be part of NASCAR sporting events. You may be familiar with the formerly known as the Washington Redskins, finally changed their name after 40 years of a dispute to the Washington Commanders. You might be familiar with products like Aunt Jemima's syrup, Uncle Ben's rice. All of those were products that were re-examined and reconsidered for their marketing materials. Most recently, as of today, there was news that Jackson Lee Highway in Virginia, named after Stonewall Jackson, which was a Confederate leader, and Robert E. Lee, they just passed a motion to change those names. And last week, 650 name changes regarding offensive words regarding Indigenous women were removed. Many federal landmarks use the word squaw as a part of the name, and that is an offensive term in the Indigenous language to describe a woman. It's a racist term. So many of those have been changed. So the catalyst for this movement has been going on for generations, but most recently, the death of people like George Floyd and massacres throughout the United States have really drawn attention to this. Jamie, next slide. So when I'm talking about memorials, and if you want to think about memorials on your campus, these are things that not only include statues, but we're talking about building names who may have buildings that may have been named after leaders of the Confederacy, buildings that may be named after a staunch segregationist, or someone who is involved in voter suppression, or someone who is involved in lynchings and massacres. And these things are documented, well documented throughout history. We also have location names that might be on your campus or in your downtown. There are monuments on campuses that may carry these names as well, just as there may be symbols. I think the most common symbol we'll be familiar with is the Confederate flag. Now, let me take this opportunity to ask one of our poll questions. Jamie, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the first poll question.
Poll question.
And while Jamie gets this question ready, I'll read the full question for you. Which category best describes your institution's status in relation to disputed memorials? And I'll give you the examples that are right here on the screen. Do you have a statue on campus, building names on campus? Is there a symbol on campus that has been a product of dispute on your campus? Now, you may have the following choices. We don't have a disputed memorial on campus. We have a disputed memorial, but we have not had a formal process to discuss it. Or we have disputed memorials and a formal process has been implemented to consider removing or retaining it. So what's the status on your campus? Don't have one at all. We have one, but no process. We have one and have had a process.
Got about half of the people so far who've responded. See if we can get a couple more in there. Looks like the folks on that are currently here are split. And let's end the poll. Take a look.
Okay.
So half of the folks don't have. So that's what we got.
All right. Thank you. Throughout today's conversation, I hope that those of you who have had this experience on your campus can share and talk about what that experience was like, what was the memorial perhaps, and how it was resolved on your campus, because we will talk about this more. One of the questions that emerges throughout this research is this question about what are students protesting? Is it the building name? Is it the statue's removal? The building name and the statue removal ends up being the catalyst, ends up being the starting point for this conversation. But when I read all of the reports and read all of the student complaints and read all of the concerns that brought universities together to examine these, here was the thing that jumped off the paper at me. And this is included in the book that I referenced. Memorial protests are not about building names and statues. Removing building names and statues are single and symbolic acts, but the structures, universities must address the complex and hidden structures, policies, legacies, and landscapes that maintain racism and reinforce systemic oppression. Students are disappointed about the disconnect between purported values and their lived experiences. Many students chose a university because of its diversity, equity, inclusion, and its mission statement, and the pictures on its websites about diverse students and how welcoming the environment is. However, when they arrive and they confront a Confederate memorial, or they learn that the building that they're taking their chemistry classes in is named after a eugenics scientist or a staunch segregationist, the students start to say, wait a minute, this isn't consistent with why I came to this university. This isn't what I thought was part of the marketing materials. I'll continue with the statement. Memorial disputes are not about any single issue or assessing a historical figure's worthiness to be commemorated. Simply stated, memorial disputes challenge the commemoration of white supremacy. Universities that ignore these connections are complicit in their promotion. So this is precisely what students are bringing to the administration in their protests. When they show up in the president's office, this is what they want to address, not the building name alone, but they want to talk about the university that they hold dear to their heart. They want to talk about why are we remaining complicit in this offensive language and this offensive display. Next slide, please. So here's how universities responded to students who came forward. As I mentioned, there were 25 universities who were included in this report. After summarizing them, some common themes emerged. And the common themes around how universities responded include the following. First, the president would issue a charge. And there are 4 different types of charges the president's issued. One, they would ask a task force or committee to consider whether the name of a building or statue should be removed as a yes or no question. Should we change the name? Yes or no? And they made it clear to the task force, don't tell us which name to change it to, Just answer the yes or no question. The second type of charge that a president may issue is to ask the task force, how do we contextualize the existing memorial or the existing building name? Meaning, don't remove it. It will not be removed, but we need the committee to help us think about ways to make this digestible to the community. How do we contextualize it? What do we add next to it to help people feel better about Robert E. Lee's name on this building? So contextualization was a charge. The third type of charge is for the committee or task force to come up with the principles only. How do we evaluate this? Give us a list of principles that we should consider. You don't make a yes or no decision, task force, but you tell us which principles the university should use to do this. And then the fourth type of charge, the most comprehensive one, is for the task force or committee to come up with principles and then apply those principles into a recommendation that would be used by the president or the board of trustees to make a decision. Second, the task force. The task force is usually an average of 12 individuals. What is most recognizable about many of the task forces is that it underrepresents students in every circumstance. On average, only 2 students are included on some of the task forces. Now, there are a few universities that had no students at all. Some universities, a few universities had only trustees. That was Princeton University and Clemson University were trustees only. Then there were a few universities who had faculty members only. Michigan and Indiana only included faculty. But overall, most universities underrepresented students, with the exception of Bowling Green State University, that had about half students, half faculty and staff represented on their task force. But the average size of a task force is usually 12, and it usually does not represent the student body. I mentioned there were guiding principles. The president may ask the task force to establish a set of guiding principles to help guide the group's decision-making. Whether that task force would apply the principles or not was a different matter. Here are the 5 most common guiding principles. Number 1, how can we use this memorial as a teaching opportunity for our university? How do we teach students about what it means and why we are not removing it? Number 2, let's be cautious about erasing history. I'll put that in air quotes. Some felt like removing a statue or symbol or building name now erased history. Well, we all know that a building name is not the history of any single memorial. History is contained in textbooks and libraries, not in the name of a building at a single campus in the United States. The third principle was consider the entire meaning of the memorial as part of the evaluation. Often we take a single component of an individual's life and say they owned enslaved people. Now let's remove them, right? So the task force is being asked to, let's consider the entirety of the individual's life. Were they a national leader? Did they also help fight for the country's independence? Were they part of some other solutions in the country, whether it be in medicine or science? And owning enslaved people was also part of their legacy as well. But the bottom line was the task force was asked to consider the entirety of an individual's life rather than a single act or a single behavior. The fourth principle was about the era that the behavior was conducted in. The task force were asked to consider, was this behavior appropriate during the time it was being conducted? Or was it considered wrong and offensive even in the era that it was being performed? And then the fifth common principle was to consider the impact that this memorial or building name has on the campus. So those were the major principles considered as task forces went through their work. And last, I'd like to talk about the decisions that were made. Some of you mentioned about half of us memorials were removed, about half of us indicated the memorials were not. But we'll get a chance to answer that question in the next poll question here. In the memorials that were considered, 25 universities, 56 memorials were involved. 25 of them were retained, 28 of them were removed, and 5 of them were relocated. So out of the 56 memorials, 25 retained, 28 removed, and 5 were relocated to a museum or history or science center near campus. Those that were retained, the university used 2 approaches. One I mentioned before, contextualization. They added plaque next to the symbol, or they added something else in the area to explain memorial. They also used a strategy called counter-memorialization, meaning they added another memorial in an effort to balance the environment, in an effort to say, in addition to the Confederate soldier, we also have a civil rights leader that's right next to it. All of these were efforts to help the community feel better about an offensive landmark or landscape. Counter-memorialization and contextualization doesn't work. The protests will return. The students will remain unsettled about Robert E. Lee's commemoration on your campus, no matter who you add next to them. Look at the story at the University of Texas or Princeton University. All of them attempted efforts to add a counter memorial or to add something else to celebrate it, and it doesn't work in the end. It will eventually be protested again. Vernon, would you mind putting up that second poll question?
Sure. Poll question number 2.
And I'll read this poll question while we get ready for it. If you had a formal process to examine a disputed memorial, what was the outcome? I believe half of the group indicated that you did have at least a disputed memorial on campus. If you had a formal process for it, what was the outcome? Was the memorial retained? Was it removed? Or was it relocated?
So it looks like of the folks, we've got 2 folks, one where the memorial was retained and one where the memorial was removed.
Okay. Good deal. All right. Thank you for responding to that. So about 50-50 with the group that we have here. I'll dive into the next part of the work, which I think is the most important finding in the book. How do we grapple with this? From examining 25 university responses to this, these 4 frameworks emerged from the work. These weren't frameworks that were implied on the work or applied to the work. By reading all of the reports, all of the documents, the history behind this, these 4 frames emerge, and I'll dive into each one individually. The first framework that task forces or committee will have to grapple with is this question about the principal legacy. What was the honoree primarily known for? Look, we can look through history and take any historical figure, and there was something in their behavior that we may find offensive today. But was that their principal legacy? Was that their primary contribution to the world? Was that their primary contribution to politics, the country's independence, science, chemistry, math, medicine? Was that their primary contribution? So the question is about their principal legacy. And this question is all about, how do we examine the totality of a person? The second question is a question about preservation. As humans, we all want to retain something. We want something to be protected and preserved for future generations to look at, to learn about our country's history. So everything is not erased or removed or never mentioned again. What are the things that a university should decide? We think this is important enough to preserve. Maybe not preserve it in its current structure and its current location, but it's important enough that future generations of students know about this. How does a university grapple with that and the campus's memorial representation of Confederate soldiers, segregationists, those who were involved in eugenics, those who were involved in voter suppression? How should we remember that this happened or not? The next question is about landscape fairness, and landscape fairness is about considering the population of students that you have on campus. And as we invite more members to our community from all over the world, as more Indigenous students come to campus, how do we think about the landscape? And is this landscape fair to all students? One of the examples that I often give to bring this home for people is to think about a swastika on campus. How would we reconcile how offensive that is to members of our community? People might be surprised, but a swastika is equally offensive as a Confederate flag on campus. Yet, many universities continue to wave the Confederate flag at athletic events and other games. But when we start to examine the impact on the individuals who may be offended in our community, how does the landscape change our decision-making? How does it help us come up with new solutions? And then the fourth and final question is the moral standards question. Which set of moral standards should be used to make this decision? Should it be the moral standards of 1850? Or should we use the moral standards of 2020? In 1850, some things were permitted that we would not consider doing again today. Some things were heinous in the 1850s that we would find completely offensive today. So which moral standards should be used to make this decision? The standards of the 1850s or the standards of the 2020s? And these are the four frameworks that many have grappled with. So let me dive into the principal legacy question. And I think here's, for me, one of the best examples. What was the honoree primarily known for? Many of you are familiar with Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. Woodrow Wilson established what's called the League of Nations. Today, we know it as the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson signed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in the United States. Woodrow Wilson provided and created efficiencies in the federal government that we continue to enjoy today with regard to issues of how the federal government oversees banking and regulations of businesses throughout the United States. Woodrow Wilson was involved in child labor laws and saying that children should not work beyond a certain amount of hours, and in fact, at a certain age, children should not be employed at all. He was the 13th president of Princeton University. He was the governor of New Jersey. But Woodrow Wilson was also a staunch segregationist. He supported the Ku Klux Klan, and he screened the film The Birth of a Nation in the White House, the first movie that was screened in the White House. And his comments soon after the film was, the only problem with Birth of a Nation is that it is shockingly true. And The Birth of a Nation was one of the most offensive movies that promoted the Ku Klux Klan and insulted every Black leader that was taking on political positions in the United States. It is one of the most offensive movies ever created, and it led to the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was promoted by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson reintroduced segregation to the federal government. The federal government had been one of the few places that Blacks and whites could work together in the same offices. When he arrived in office, he implemented a Jim Crow style of the federal government by separating all employees by race. Now, Princeton University has the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. It's one of the most prominent schools at Princeton University. Their first attempt was to consider the memorialization of Woodrow Wilson, and they had to grapple with these questions around principal legacy. Which side of his legacy should we weigh and continue to honor? So the principal legacy is about asking questions like, was his behavior freely chosen? Did he do it repeatedly? Did he do it with intention? Were there enduring and ongoing consequences of his behavior to groups of people? Did his work and his efforts cause harm? So evaluating the principal legacy is about grappling with these questions about what he was really about. Princeton University first attempted to retain Woodrow Wilson by contextualizing his work and adding information around his name to inform others. The day after the death of George Floyd, the board reconvened and reconsidered Woodrow Wilson as a memorial at the university, and his name was thus removed. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the question of preservation. The United States has a long list of things that we preserve. We preserve national parks, oceans, shipwrecks, film, pictures, We have a long history of preservation, even as a global community. In times of war, invading armies are warned not to destroy museums and artifacts of other countries, because these are things that belong to all of humanity. So preservation is not an uncommon topic for colleges and universities and throughout the United States. Here's an example at Middle Tennessee State University. Middle Tennessee State University has a building named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a leader in the Confederate Army. He was from Nashville, Tennessee. After the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest became the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1954, not in 1868 after the Civil War, but in 1954, Middle Tennessee State University named the Army ROTC building after Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you recall, in the early 1950s, colleges and universities were being required to integrate. Soon after Brown versus Board of Education, all white universities and schools in K through 12 were required to integrate. Many schools in the South responded to integration by adding Confederate memorials to campus to let students know that this would not be an inviting place to them. So in 1954 and 58, Nathan Bedford Forrest's name was added to the campus of Middle Tennessee State University. In 2017, the students protested this. This act went to the Tennessee government, and the Tennessee government has in place what's called Heritage Protection Acts. There are 8 states that have Heritage Protection Acts throughout the United States. All of them are located in the South. All of them are former Confederate states. And these acts prohibit the removal of Confederate memorials. So if you're in any of those 8 states, you do have to consider memorial removal in a completely different way, because there are laws that prohibit removal in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. These are states that prohibit removal of Confederate memorials, but it creates a greater question about preservation and where these memorials should be preserved. I did have a poll question on this, Jamie, but there aren't enough people to really make it a significant question. Few of us are from those states to make it worth the discussion. So let me move to the next question that universities should grapple with. Is all about the landscape fairness. The landscape is never neutral. Building names, street names, and monuments signal whose contributions are valued. They signal who feels important, who has the power. And this is what a university landscape communicates to incoming students. The best example here is the University of Texas. They had a main mall on campus that included 6 statues. 4 of those statues were Confederate leaders. Confederate leaders who had no relationship to the campus, like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army. They never went to Texas. They were not from Texas, but the University of Texas had those memorials on campus since the 1930s. Well, in 2017, after Charlottesville riots, the university president at the time finally declared that those memorials should be removed from campus. When we think about the landscape, these landscapes marginalize students who already feel marginalized. These memorials, these buildings and statues are extremely offensive to students as they attempt to go to class every day. In some cases, there are buildings that are named after these individuals, which makes it really hard for students to participate in any classes in buildings with these names. Last slide, or next slide. Here's the next question. The 4th question that universities have to grapple with is the moral standards question. Which standards should be used? The standards of the past or the standards of today? So there's something called presentism, where we only consider today's values. The past does not matter. Presentism says, would we memorialize this today? Therefore, if the answer to that question is no, then it should be removed. But there's some historians who say we should also consider what was going on in the past. And that theory is known as historical relativism, that we should say, relative to the 1800s or to the 1850s, this was permitted. At the time that this individual was being honored throughout the United States. So we should honor the past generation's values. There's a debate in those two, and many committees will debate whether we should preserve the values of the past or preserve the values of the future and the current generation. And that debate goes on, and both of those questions need to be deliberated in these task forces, which is an important point for them to grapple with. Next slide. As I mentioned, there are 4 frameworks to grapple with. One of the things that we've been struggling with as a society is how we have intelligent conversations over topics that are really hard. And that's what Confederate and segregationist memorials do on campus. There are usually strong dividing lines between the support and opposition to these memorials. We have not found a place that we can have an intelligent conversation about this, speak the truth about what they mean, talk about how painful they are to individuals in the communities. Today, these arguments end up in contentious fights. This framework of how to grapple with it forces us to think intellectually about this topic. What is the principal legacy? What was the memorial really about? What was the individual really about? What should we preserve as a campus? But more importantly, where should we preserve it? Should we ask students to live in a residence hall named after a Confederate leader, named after a segregationist, named after a person who was involved in lynchings and massacres, and honor that? Or should that be moved to a museum on campus and put in an appropriate context so students may learn that history on their choice, rather than live and try to form community in John C. Calhoun Residence Hall? John C. Calhoun was a former vice president of the United States, but was a staunch segregationist and promoted slavery and died fighting to preserve slavery before the Civil War. Yet at Yale University, he was the name of one of the university's residential colleges, and that name was removed as well. Should we consider the landscape fairness? As we invite Indigenous students to the campus, they will notice that very little of the campus represents their interests. Much of the campus is on Indigenous lands. In fact, all of the campus, our campus is on Indigenous land, yet we don't represent any of their values and any of their symbols and names on campus. However, many statues and memorials that offend them remain on our campuses. And last but not least, I've mentioned the moral standards. Which standards should we use to have these difficult conversations? Jamie, thank you for giving me, Vernon, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Jamie. Vernon, thank you for giving me so much time to have this conversation, and I would love to open the floor for questions.
Well, first of all, you and I and Jamie hang out all the time. So
that's what
I'm like, it's just normal. It's just fun. But no, thank you. Thank you. You know, Ainsley, I'd love for folks, if folks have, we have an opportunity if folks want to unmute and share a question, just, raise your hand and we can, so we'll know who wants to ask something. I just want to say thank you, Ainsley. What I'm excited about is just the conversation around the context that you gave, really giving folks an opportunity to say, this is tough. Mm-hmm. This is a tough conversation to have, and we've got to have it.
Yes.
And, what was new to me was I knew that there were laws around preservation, but I did not know that there were laws around relocation.
Yes. Yes, let me speak to that. So great example, University of North Carolina. University of North Carolina had a Confederate statue on campus named Silent Sam. Mm-hmm. Silent Sam had been there since the early 1900s, 1913-ish. And on the dedication of Silent Sam, Julian Shakespeare read a quote about his dedication of Silent Sam. And one of the things he talked about was this statue is here to essentially remind Black people of the place that they have in society. And he promoted this statue as a way to remind the future generations of their role in society and position in society. Well, in the 1960s, as University of North Carolina was being integrated, students were asking for the statue to be removed. The administration simply didn't respond to it. In 2017, students took matters into their own hand and tied a rope around Silent Sam and pulled it down. So that was in 2017. And then the state of North Carolina has in place their own Heritage Protection Acts. And that act prohibited them from moving the statue to somewhere else. So even they went to the legislature, asked for permission to put it into a museum. That was not accepted. They attempted to sell the statue back to the Confederate brothers of the community, and the state would not allow them to do that. So the statue had to remain in that same vicinity of where it was mounted. The state went through a very difficult 2 to 3 year period trying to decide what should happen with the memorial. It was eventually removed. A great deal of corruption and activities went on behind the scene, but the memorial was removed. And the president there was Carol Folt. Carol Folt soon after left the University of North Carolina, is now the president of the University of Southern California. But this was a very contentious point for a 3 year period at the University of North Carolina. But in those statutes, they restrict removing them, period. They restrict relocating them, and sometimes they put a distance that they should be relocated, no more than 90 yards or so that they would put into them. So if you live in any of those states, just be aware that there are Heritage Protection Acts that prohibit removal of these memorials.
Wow, that's good to know. What would you share with folks who are on campuses which are pretty much every campus in our country, and in Canada and around the world, that have memorials that are problematic? What are, if you would give them sort of 5 things they need to be doing right now, what would you share?
Oh, that's a good question. So here's where I think it begins. This is a leadership question. This eventually, students will bring this to the leadership of the university administration. If I'm sitting on a campus and any of these memorials are on campus, I am going to the president's office to say, this will come up. One of the things that none of my research was able to reveal was anytime that the university was proactive, that the university said on its own, we have discovered this, and here's what we're going to do to move forward. So in every incident, students brought this forward, and they brought it forward through protests because generations of students have been asking for it to be removed. There has not been a proactive effort for the university to initiate a conversation. And I wouldn't suggest the university plainly remove it on their own. I would suggest that the university proactively establish a conversation to say, we learned recently that this rock or statue or memorial or symbol on our campus represents something that is not consistent with our values. We would like to begin a community conversation to talk about the appropriate disposition of this item and open the floor for the community to participate. And at the same time, I'll answer one of the questions here. As I mentioned, the task force composition is about 12 members. I think it should be somewhat represented. 12 is a good manageable size. Students, faculty, and staff should be part of this conversation. I have found the best task forces have included representation from the history department and law department, because many of the laws of the time talk a lot about the history of how these things were established when it came. So if you have law faculty or history faculty, that would be great. An underused resource on our campus is the library's archivist. There's a person on your campus who understands, who is aware of every building name, every memorial, every statue, but we underutilize the library's archivists. We should engage them in the process, because what's happening in these memorial debates, no one is telling the truth, or we're making it up as we go along. We're using internet resources to discover the history of an individual, but we don't stop to say, no, what do the history books say? Not Breitbart.com, but what do the history books say about this individual? So let's get to the truth of what's going on. but my strongest recommendation is that a university should inventory their list of building names, understand who's on their campus, and host a proactive conversation about the best disposition of it, even if it's something that the university administration agrees should be removed. In fact, I would say take this as an opportunity to have the conversation and allow people to grapple with it. But this requires courageous leadership to say, we have discovered something that many people will disagree with on both sides. And I'm willing, as vice president or president of the university, to risk my administration to have this conversation, because often these end in presidents leaving universities or VPs for students leaving universities. I wanted to make sure I produced a product that people can have this conversation in an intelligent way.
I love the call to encourage campuses to be proactive and not wait until a protest happens, because
Yes.
it will happen.
Yes.
It will in time. So why
Yes.
not be proactive? Why not have the conversation now? I love your suggestions too around the makeup of the intentional makeup of the task force. Who should be there?
That's right.
And it's so frustrating when I hear of campuses that use trustees to make these decisions. And I'm thinking, of all people, they should be neutral anyway. So I'm like,
Yes.
of all people. But right now we're sort of moving through a time when trustees and board of regents are shifting in terms of their outreach, or their overreach, I should say,
Yes.
into the institution. So this is an interesting time to see this sort of evolve.
Yes, and here's the struggle for trustees and university administration. The building names on campus, and how much we accept from a donor to name a building, it's not the decision of the president of the university, nor the chief financial officer, nor the chief fundraising officer. The trustees are entrusted with the building's names. In nearly every university agreement with their trustees, the trustees have that fiduciary responsibility to the finances of the university, but also the naming of university buildings. So that's how they end up getting involved. But what they don't do is allow members of the community to be part of that process. So it has been a very difficult balancing act for trustees involved. I would say involved, as you mentioned, students, members of the faculty, history and law specifically, but there may be other disciplines that I think would do this, and staff members who are involved in diversity, multicultural affairs, who are paying attention to these issues nationally, the university's archivists. One area that I didn't mention, a few universities use 1 or 2 members from the community, meaning an alum or the local pastor or the local mayor, someone in the community who also sees this from a community perspective, because the campus impacts the community and vice versa.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about community members, because as I think about, I worked at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill 2 years as an area coordinator, my second job out of grad school. And even and that was in the early 90s, there was rumblings about Silent Sam. And I remember students talking about how do you balance, the history along with the current piece. And what I'm noticing too is a lot of student affairs professionals take jobs into communities. Well, they take jobs in communities where they don't know the context. Yes. So if you're not from North Carolina, you don't know the history. And so what can you do when you enter the conversation to say, well, what does this mean? And learn more about the context, and not just be that person who comes in and says, this is offensive, take it down.
Right.
Find out more.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree with that. That is such an important point about student affairs professionals. We parachute into communities and we have no idea what the community values. And often as a young Ainsley Carey arrives at the University of Arkansas and says, this is completely ridiculous, this is offensive. I'm importing values that have not been acknowledged in that community yet. And it could be helpful to move the community forward, but it won't be helpful for my career there. I should at least take the time to respect the values of the community, understand the values of the community, and find an effective way to be an ally in that community.
Well, Ainsley, I know we're sort of running out of time. I see that Abby responded to Megan's question. Yes, we will be sending out a recording of this session, actually all of the sessions this week, next week. So you'll have that, and definitely share this with senior leaders. I think it's a great idea to, if you have senior leaders on your campus who are sort of not really in the proactive space, I would definitely share this with them and share Ainsley as a resource to really have these conversations.
Yes.
So Ainsley, thank you so much. If folks want to be in touch with Ainsley, his information is in the profile that we sent for this session, and you can easily find him. He's at the University of British Columbia, doing some great work, and continues to really engage the higher education community in ways that we need to be engaged with, having the conversation we need to. And thank you, Ainsley, for being such a great friend of leadership. You've always been there for us, and really and truly, we appreciate it. Want to make sure that you know that we do have another session tomorrow. So please join us if you like. And and please, Ainsley, take in all of the accolades of the folks that are here, and know that this video will be shared with so many folks, I'm sure, after this, which is sure. Please, if you know us, you know that Leadership, we are here for you. We've got some virtual and in-person programs that we'd love to have some conversations with you about, if you're interested. So please be in touch with us. And also have to end with, we are not for profit, and we continue to think about what the world would look like if everyone led with integrity. So give some thought to, if you do have the resources, or you know of others who do, we'd love for you to donate to our wonderful organization. And thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Leadership.